There's a certain kind of inner alert that shows up before something important tries to reach you. Not anxiety. Not excitement. Just a quiet sense of attention, like your awareness has sharpened without effort. This part begins there, because when something truly matters, it doesn't rush into your life noisily. It asks for presence first. Your soulmate needs to speak with you right now, not because of urgency driven by fear, but because something has shifted in a way that can no longer be carried alone. This isn't about nostalgia. It isn't about missing you in a soft, sentimental way. It's about information. And information has weight when it's been held back too long. Something important happened on their side, and it changed how they see the past, the present, and the space you occupy in both. This didn't come from a sudden impulse. It came from a moment of clarity they didn't expect. Often, clarity arrives when someone is confronted with the consequences of their own patterns. Not dramatically. Quietly. Through an experience that mirrors their choices back to them without commentary. They may have faced a situation where silence didn't protect them the way it once did. Where hesitation created loss instead of safety. Where delaying a conversation led to an outcome they can't undo. Those moments have a way of stripping away excuses. And once excuses fall, truth becomes unavoidable. What they realized wasn't just about you. It was about themselves. About how often they relied on avoidance when responsibility was required. About how staying quiet felt easier than being honest. About how they underestimated the impact of not speaking when something mattered. That realization didn't sit lightly. They tried to move past it. They tried to rationalize it. But something about this time felt different. Because for the first time, they weren't able to tell themselves that everything would sort itself out eventually. They saw clearly that not everything waits. Some things require action in real time. You may feel this as a subtle pull toward awareness rather than emotion. Not longing. Not confusion. Just a sense that something is about to be said that changes the shape of the story, even if it doesn't rewrite the past. And that distinction matters. This isn't about reopening old wounds. It's about acknowledging something that was never named properly. It's about speaking a truth that stayed unspoken because it felt inconvenient at the time. And now, it no longer feels optional. Your soulmate isn't reaching from a place of comfort. They're reaching from a place of responsibility finally settling in. Responsibility doesn't ask whether it's the right time emotionally. It asks whether it's the right thing to do. That's where they are now. You might notice that you're not reacting the way you once would have to the idea of hearing from them. There's no rush of emotion. No spike of hope or fear. There's steadiness. Almost neutrality. That's not indifference. That's readiness without attachment. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You're open to hearing truth. That shift in you is what makes this moment possible without destabilizing you. For a long time, the idea of them needing to speak might have sent you into overthinking. You would have wondered what it meant, what they wanted, whether it would lead somewhere or reopen something painful. Now, you're more interested in what's being carried than in what it might lead to. You want honesty, not outcome. Your soulmate knows this intuitively. They sense that they can't approach you with half clarity anymore. They can't lean on familiarity. They can't assume emotional access without accountability. Whatever they need to say has to stand on its own, without expectation of forgiveness, continuation, or reassurance. That awareness is sobering. Something important happened that forced them to see the cost of silence clearly. It might have been watching someone else walk away without explanation. It might have been losing an opportunity because they hesitated too long. It might have been realizing that a pattern they thought was harmless has consequences they can no longer ignore. Whatever it was, it brought you into focus not as a memory, but as a reference point. A moment where things could have been handled differently if courage had been present. This doesn't mean they expect to fix the past. It means they can no longer pretend it didn't matter. You don't need to prepare for this conversation emotionally. Preparation implies fear. You're not afraid. You're grounded. You know who you are now. You know what you will and won't accept. You know that hearing the truth won't undo your growth. If anything, it will meet you where you are. That's why this moment feels steady instead of dramatic. You're not leaning forward hoping it changes everything. You're standing still, letting whatever is real approach you honestly. If they speak, you'll hear more than words. You'll notice tone. Ownership. Whether the message carries responsibility or relief-seeking. And you won't rush to respond. You trust yourself to take your time. And if they don't speak yet, that doesn't pull you backward. You're not dependent on this conversation to feel complete. You're complete enough to listen without needing it to lead anywhere specific. That's the difference between then and now. This part of the story isn't about reunion or closure. It's about truth arriving without demand. About something important finally being acknowledged instead of avoided. You are not being asked to reopen anything. You are being asked to witness honesty. And you are strong enough for that. Whatever is said next will not define you. It will reveal them. And revelation doesn't threaten you anymore. You no longer confuse information with obligation. You are free to hear and remain yourself. This message begins here because this moment is not about what happens after the conversation. It's about the fact that you are finally in a place where hearing the truth won't cost you your peace. That alone tells you how much you've grown. If you want, next we can continue with part 2 in the same flow, keeping every hook completely different and the tone fully human. There's a weight that comes with knowing someone needs to speak, especially when that need didn't exist before. Not the anxious kind of weight, but the kind that makes the air feel denser, like something meaningful is being carried closer. This part begins in that space, where you sense that whatever is coming isn't about emotion spilling over, but about truth finally asking to be heard. Your soulmate isn't reaching out because they suddenly miss you. That feeling would be easier. This urge comes from something more unsettling. Something happened that disrupted their internal balance. Not an external drama, not a crisis meant to impress you, but a moment that exposed a pattern they could no longer ignore. It might have been a situation where they watched someone else react the way you once did. Calm on the surface, distant underneath. Or a moment where silence cost them something they assumed would always wait. Or even a realization that the way they've been moving through relationships keeps leading to the same hollow outcome. These moments don't announce themselves as wake-up calls. They feel like discomfort that won't go away. They tried to sit with it quietly. They told themselves it wasn't connected to you. They tried to move forward without addressing it. But the truth has a way of circling back to its origin. And when it did, you came into focus not as someone from the past, but as the moment where things first went wrong. Not wrong emotionally. Wrong structurally. They're realizing now that what they avoided wasn't conflict. It was responsibility. Responsibility to speak clearly. Responsibility to show up when uncertainty existed. Responsibility to acknowledge impact instead of assuming good intentions were enough. That realization changes the tone of everything. You may feel this as a subtle internal shift. Not excitement. Not dread. Just a heightened awareness that whatever is said next will land differently than it would have before. Because you are different now. You're not waiting for validation. You're not hoping for repair. You're not bracing for disappointment. You're listening from a place of stability. In the past, the idea of them needing to talk might have stirred up questions. What do they want? Why now? Does this mean something will change? Those questions don't dominate you anymore. You're more interested in whether what's being said carries ownership or simply releases pressure on their side. That discernment didn't come easily. It came from living too long in spaces where clarity was postponed. From learning how draining it is to wait for someone else to decide whether to be honest. From realizing that silence doesn't always mean confusion. Sometimes it means avoidance. This time feels different because you're not participating in the old dynamic. Your soulmate knows this, even if they can't articulate it. They sense that approaching you now requires more than emotional language. They can't lean on nostalgia. They can't soften the truth to make it easier to hear. Whatever they need to say has to stand on its own, without expectation of reassurance or continuation. That awareness creates hesitation. Not because they don't want to speak, but because they know that speaking now means facing themselves more than facing you. It means acknowledging how long they waited. How often they chose comfort over clarity. How many moments they let pass because they assumed there would always be another chance. That assumption has cracked. Something important happened that showed them not everything resets. Not everything stays available. Not everyone remains open indefinitely. Some doors don't slam shut. They quietly stop responding. You didn't close that door angrily. You closed it by growing. This conversation, if and when it happens, is not meant to reopen it. It's meant to acknowledge what was left unsaid when it mattered. And that distinction is crucial. You are not being pulled backward. You are being met where you are now. You might notice that your body feels grounded when you think about hearing from them. No tightness. No racing thoughts. That groundedness is your signal that you're no longer emotionally dependent on what's coming. You're capable of hearing truth without letting it destabilize you. That's strength. Your soulmate is likely aware that they're not approaching the same version of you. They sense that emotional access now requires integrity. That half-truths won't land. That avoidance disguised as gentleness won't be received kindly. They can feel that whatever they say must be clean. Clean doesn't mean painless. It means honest. This moment isn't about them seeking forgiveness. Forgiveness would center their relief. This is about acknowledgement. Naming something that stayed unnamed because it was uncomfortable. Owning the fact that silence had consequences. Recognizing that not speaking was a choice, not a neutral act. You don't need to guide this conversation. You don't need to prepare talking points. You don't need to manage their emotions. You're not responsible for making this easier. You're responsible only for staying grounded in yourself. If they speak, you'll notice the difference immediately. Not in how emotional they sound, but in whether they take ownership without defensiveness. Whether they name impact without justification. Whether they speak from awareness rather than guilt. And you'll know what that means for you. If they hesitate longer, that also tells you something. Not something painful. Something clarifying. It shows you the limits of where responsibility still stops for them. And you won't feel compelled to wait that out. This part of the story is not about outcome. It's about alignment between who you are now and what you're willing to receive. You're no longer open to conversations that reopen wounds without offering truth. You're no longer available for emotional unloading that leaves you carrying weight again. You want clarity without cost. And you're prepared to walk away from anything that doesn't meet that standard. That readiness changes everything. Your soulmate reaching out now is not fate intervening. It's consequence arriving. Consequence of reflection. Consequence of awareness. Consequence of realizing that what was avoided doesn't disappear just because time passes. You are no longer afraid of that consequence touching your life. You trust yourself enough to hear what's true and decide calmly what belongs with you moving forward and what doesn't. This is why this moment matters. Not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because something honest finally can. And honesty, when it arrives this late, doesn't come to change the past. It comes to stop repeating it. Whether that honesty leads to further conversation or stands alone as acknowledgement is not something you need to decide right now. You're not rushing anything. You're allowing truth to approach at its own pace. That's the difference between then and now. Before, you waited in uncertainty hoping clarity would arrive. Now, you're steady enough to let clarity arrive without chasing it. This part of the story continues not because you need it to, but because you're strong enough to let it unfold without losing yourself inside it. And that's exactly where you are meant to be as this moment approaches. There is a different kind of stillness that follows once you accept that someone needs to speak, but you don't rush toward that moment anymore. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer feel incomplete without answers. This part begins there, in that steady internal space where anticipation has softened into readiness, and readiness has nothing to prove. You're not waiting by your phone. You're not replaying possible conversations. You're not imagining what they might say or how it might land. Instead, you're noticing how grounded you feel simply knowing that something important exists outside of your control, and that you no longer need to manage it. That's new. In the past, the idea that your soulmate needed to talk would have unsettled you. You would have felt a pull to prepare emotionally, to brace yourself for disappointment or hope. You might have told yourself to stay calm while secretly wanting resolution. That internal tug-of-war is gone now. What replaced it is trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in your ability to hear truth without collapsing into it. Trust in your capacity to respond rather than react. You didn't arrive at this trust overnight. It came from sitting through unanswered questions long enough to realize that your stability cannot depend on someone else's timing. That realization reshaped you. Your soulmate is approaching this moment from a very different internal place. For them, needing to speak isn't calming. It's confronting. It means facing a version of themselves they avoided for a long time. The version that chose delay over clarity. The version that believed good intentions would eventually smooth over silence. Something disrupted that belief. Whatever happened wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with loud consequences. It came quietly, in a moment that forced reflection. A realization that silence doesn't preserve peace. It only postpones discomfort. And postponed discomfort doesn't disappear. It accumulates. That accumulation reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. They're realizing now that what they avoided saying didn't stay neutral. It shaped the connection. It shaped you. And it shaped how they see themselves when they're honest. That kind of realization doesn't come with confidence. It comes with humility. You may feel the difference in how this moment sits inside you. There's no rush to hear from them because you already know something essential. Whatever they say will not define you. It may inform you. It may clarify something. But it won't destabilize the ground you're standing on. That's the power of growth that's already integrated. You're no longer emotionally invested in being understood by someone who couldn't meet you with clarity when it mattered. Understanding would be welcome, but it's no longer required for your peace. You've already done the work of understanding yourself. That's why this conversation, if it happens, feels optional rather than necessary. Your soulmate senses this shift, even if they don't articulate it consciously. They know they're not speaking to the same version of you who waited patiently, who made room for uncertainty, who stayed open despite confusion. They're speaking to someone who knows their own limits now. That awareness adds weight to what they need to say. They can't approach you lightly. They can't minimize the past. They can't gloss over impact. Whatever they speak now has to come from responsibility rather than relief. And responsibility feels heavier than regret. Regret wants comfort. Responsibility wants truth. You're not here to provide comfort anymore. You're here to witness honesty, if it arrives. You may notice that your curiosity about this conversation isn't emotional. It's observational. You're curious about how responsibility shows up in another person when they can no longer avoid it. You're curious about whether awareness leads to accountability or stops short of it. And you're curious without attachment. That's a powerful place to be. This moment isn't pulling you back into the past. It's meeting you in the present. You're no longer measuring what's said against what you hoped would happen back then. You're listening from who you are now, not who you were then. That distinction protects you. If they speak, you'll hear not just their words, but their posture. You'll notice whether they take ownership without explaining themselves away. Whether they acknowledge impact without reframing it to feel better. Whether they accept that timing matters and that clarity delayed has consequences. You won't interrupt. You won't defend. You won't rush to reassure. You'll simply listen. And listening doesn't mean agreeing. It means allowing truth to stand without immediately deciding what it requires from you. That patience is no longer self-sacrificial. It's self-contained. If they don't speak yet, that information lands differently too. It doesn't feel like rejection or avoidance that needs to be solved. It feels like confirmation of where their capacity still stops. And you don't feel compelled to push past that boundary. You respect it by stepping back. This part of the story is not about forcing a resolution. It's about allowing reality to reveal itself without interference. You're not here to rescue the moment. You're not here to make it easier. You're not here to reopen something that's already been processed. You're here to stay aligned. Alignment doesn't demand answers. It recognizes them when they appear. Your soulmate's need to speak exists because something inside them shifted. Your steadiness exists because something inside you resolved. Those two states can meet without creating chaos, because you're no longer seeking something from them. You're open, not needy. Present, not attached. Aware, not reactive. That balance is rare. You didn't arrive here by avoiding pain. You arrived here by walking through it without abandoning yourself. You learned how to sit with discomfort without turning it into desperation. You learned how to let silence teach you without letting it define you. Those lessons changed how you show up now. This conversation, if it happens, will not reopen wounds. It may touch scars, but scars don't bleed. They remind. And reminders don't threaten you anymore. They inform you. You're no longer afraid of truth arriving late. You're more concerned with whether truth arrives clean. Clean truth doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't demand continuation. It doesn't expect reassurance. It simply names what was avoided and accepts the cost. You are strong enough to receive that without offering anything in return unless it genuinely aligns with your life now. That freedom didn't come from detachment. It came from self-respect settling fully into place. As this moment approaches, you may notice that your attention keeps returning to your own life rather than drifting toward them. Your days feel fuller. Your inner world feels quieter. That's not coincidence. It's a sign that your emotional center has returned home. You're no longer living in the space between what was and what might be. You're living where you are. This part of the story continues not because you're waiting for something to happen, but because you're allowing whatever is real to arrive without fear of losing yourself inside it. And that is exactly where your power is now. Whatever is spoken next will meet you here. Grounded. Clear. Whole. And nothing about that can be undone. There's a deeper quiet that settles after readiness becomes familiar, when even the idea of an important conversation no longer pulls your energy outward. This part begins there, in that grounded stillness where you're no longer oriented around what might be said, but around who you are regardless of whether words ever arrive. You're noticing something subtle but significant now. Your days aren't organized around anticipation anymore. You're not checking emotional signals from the outside world to decide how you feel inside. Your center of gravity has shifted inward, and it's staying there. That's not detachment. That's ownership. In earlier phases of this connection, moments like this would have felt loaded. You would have sensed the possibility of communication as something that could change your emotional weather instantly. A message could lift you or sink you. Silence could unravel you. You lived in responsiveness to something you didn't control. You don't live there anymore. Now, even the idea that your soulmate needs to speak with you exists without urgency. It doesn't hijack your focus. It doesn't dictate your mood. It doesn't ask you to prepare emotionally. You're open, but you're not suspended. That difference is everything. Your soulmate, on the other hand, is experiencing the opposite internal state. For them, this moment is heavy because it represents something they can't unsee anymore. The clarity that arrived didn't come gently. It came with the realization that certain choices, once delayed long enough, don't get erased by good intentions later. They are sitting with the understanding that not speaking earlier wasn't neutral. It shaped outcomes. It altered dynamics. It changed how they're perceived by themselves as much as by you. That awareness doesn't inspire confidence. It inspires reckoning. They may feel torn between wanting to explain and knowing that explanations won't undo impact. Between wanting relief and knowing that relief is not what this moment is for. Between wanting connection and knowing that connection now requires accountability. That tension is uncomfortable. You don't feel that tension because you've already faced it from the other side. You faced the discomfort of not knowing. You faced the ache of waiting. You faced the quiet disappointment of realizing that clarity wasn't coming when it should have. You processed that fully, long before this moment appeared. That's why you're not destabilized now. You're aware that if they speak, it won't be to change the past. It will be to acknowledge it. And acknowledgement is very different from repair. Repair requires mutual timing. Acknowledgement arrives when timing has already passed. You understand that distinction clearly. You're not confused about what this conversation can and cannot do. It can offer truth. It can offer ownership. It can offer insight into their internal shift. What it cannot do is rewind your growth or reopen a version of you that no longer exists. And you're okay with that. In fact, you prefer it. You don't want to revisit who you were when you were waiting. You don't want to re-enter a dynamic where clarity depended on patience rather than willingness. You don't want to soften your boundaries to accommodate someone else's delayed courage. Your soulmate senses that you're no longer positioned to be persuaded by emotion alone. They feel that access to you now requires coherence. Words have to match awareness. Awareness has to match behavior. Anything less will be felt immediately. That realization can be intimidating. They might find themselves rehearsing what to say, not to impress you, but to ensure they don't hide from themselves again. Because this conversation isn't really about you. You are the witness, not the destination. The real confrontation is internal. You're aware of this too. That's why you don't feel responsible for how it unfolds. You're not there to guide them through their truth. You're not there to soften the landing. You're not there to provide emotional safety for something they avoided owning earlier. You're there, if you choose to be, as yourself. Grounded. Clear. Whole. If the conversation happens, you won't rush it. You won't interrupt. You won't feel compelled to respond immediately. You'll allow space for words to exist without filling silence. Silence no longer scares you. It no longer feels like something that must be resolved. Silence is just information now. You've also noticed that you're no longer fantasizing about what this conversation might lead to. There's no storyline forming in your mind. No expectation of reconnection or closure. You're not mapping outcomes. You're staying present. Presence is your anchor. That's why even the idea of disappointment doesn't carry weight anymore. Disappointment requires hope attached to outcome. You've released that attachment without becoming cynical. You're simply realistic. Realism feels peaceful. Your soulmate is encountering the cost of realism now. They're realizing that some opportunities only exist within certain windows. That emotional access isn't infinite. That people don't stay open forever just because a bond once existed. They're not being punished by this realization. They're being educated by it. Education often arrives too late to change the original outcome, but early enough to change future behavior. Whether they use it that way is not something you need to concern yourself with. You've already graduated from this lesson. This part of the story is not about whether the conversation happens today, tomorrow, or ever. It's about the fact that your emotional world no longer revolves around unanswered questions. You're not suspended between past and future. You're anchored in the present. That anchoring gives you choice. You can choose to listen without absorbing. You can choose to acknowledge without reopening. You can choose to respond without committing. You can choose to walk away without resentment. Those options exist because you're no longer operating from need. You don't need clarity to feel stable. You don't need explanation to feel validated. You don't need acknowledgement to feel complete. You've already given those things to yourself. This is why this moment feels different from anything that came before. Not because the stakes are higher, but because your dependency is gone. You're not hoping this conversation will heal you. You're healed enough to hear it. That changes everything. If they speak, you'll hear the truth for what it is, not what you wish it would be. If they hesitate, you'll understand exactly what that hesitation means without taking it personally. Either way, you won't be pulled back into confusion. Confusion has lost its grip on you. This part of the story isn't dramatic. It's steady. It's the quiet middle where nothing explodes and nothing collapses, but something solidifies permanently inside you. You are no longer available for emotional ambiguity disguised as depth. You are no longer impressed by delayed honesty. You are no longer waiting for someone else's growth to validate your experience. You're standing firmly in your own clarity. Whatever words come next will meet you there. And whatever doesn't come will also be understood clearly. This story continues, not because you're waiting for it to, but because life continues to move forward when you're aligned with yourself. You're not paused anymore. You're present. And nothing about that depends on what anyone else decides to say. There's a stage that comes after stillness settles in, when even the importance of the moment no longer feels heavy. Not because it doesn't matter, but because you've stopped assigning it the power to define you. This part begins there, in that quiet confidence where you're no longer emotionally leaning toward what might happen, and you're no longer bracing for what might not. You've noticed something has changed in how you relate to time itself. You're not counting days. You're not marking moments. You're not mentally circling dates that once would have carried weight. Time feels neutral again. It moves forward without dragging your emotions behind it, and that neutrality is a sign of something deeply healed. In the past, when someone needed to speak with you, it carried urgency because it carried hope. Hope that clarity would finally arrive. Hope that understanding would undo confusion. Hope that words could fix what silence had already shaped. That hope kept you emotionally alert, always half ready to respond. You're not alert like that anymore. Now, you're present without anticipation. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means you no longer equate care with self-suspension. You're no longer holding yourself in an unfinished posture waiting for someone else to complete the picture. The picture is already complete. Your soulmate is still moving toward this moment from a place of internal pressure. That pressure isn't external. It's not coming from you. It's coming from awareness that has finally caught up to behavior. Awareness that has nowhere left to hide. They're realizing that what they avoided naming didn't disappear. It aged. It gained weight. And now, speaking feels heavier precisely because it comes later than it should have. Late truth carries a different tone. It's quieter. Less confident. More careful. And often filled with the awareness that it may not change anything, only acknowledge it. That awareness humbles people. You can feel this difference intuitively. Not because you're trying to read them, but because you're no longer disconnected from yourself. Your internal signals are clear now. You know when something is approaching from responsibility versus emotion, from ownership versus need. You don't confuse those anymore. This moment doesn't feel like a crossroads for you. It feels like a checkpoint you've already passed. Whether they speak or not, you're already on your path. That realization doesn't make you distant. It makes you steady. Steadiness is often misunderstood. People think it means you've closed off. But steadiness is what happens when you stop swinging between extremes. When your sense of self no longer rises and falls with someone else's readiness. That's where you are. You're also aware now that conversations don't automatically create connection. Sometimes they simply provide information. Information about how someone sees themselves. About how they handle accountability. About whether they can name impact without defending intent. You're open to information. You're no longer desperate for connection. That distinction changes everything. Your soulmate may feel the weight of knowing that whatever they say now won't be received with the same emotional openness as before. Not because you're guarded, but because you're grounded. You're no longer available for conversations that reopen wounds without offering something real. You're not there to relive the past. You're there to witness truth, if it arrives. That witness position is powerful because it doesn't require you to participate beyond your capacity. You don't have to reassure. You don't have to soften. You don't have to carry emotional labor that doesn't belong to you. You can simply listen. And listening, for you now, doesn't mean absorbing. It means allowing words to exist without immediately internalizing them. That skill took time to build. It came from realizing how often you took responsibility for other people's emotional states. You don't do that anymore. This part of the journey is marked by how little you feel the need to explain yourself. You don't need to justify your growth. You don't need to defend your boundaries. You don't need to convince anyone that your standards are reasonable. They are self-evident now. If your soulmate speaks, you'll notice whether their words reflect an understanding of timing, or if they focus only on intention. You'll sense whether they recognize that waiting changed you, or if they're hoping you stayed the same. You'll feel whether they're prepared to meet you as you are now, not as you once were. And you won't rush to decide what any of that means. You trust yourself to let meaning unfold slowly. If they don't speak, that absence no longer echoes. It doesn't create stories. It doesn't demand interpretation. It simply sits as clarity. And clarity, even when quiet, is always useful. This is one of the biggest shifts you've made. You no longer feel compelled to fill silence with meaning. You allow silence to be exactly what it is. A signal. Not a puzzle. That alone has restored so much peace. Your soulmate is likely experiencing the discomfort of realizing that emotional access is no longer guaranteed by history. That familiarity doesn't automatically grant closeness. That the space you once held open with patience has changed shape. They're not entitled to the version of you that waited. That version of you did important work, but that work is finished. You don't resent that version. You honor it. It carried you to this point. But you don't live there anymore. You live in a place where clarity matters more than continuity. This part of the story is not dramatic because it doesn't need to be. Drama comes from imbalance. From unmet needs. From uncertainty pulling at the edges of your sense of self. You're not imbalanced anymore. You know what you need. You know what you offer. You know what you will not accept. Those truths don't shout. They sit calmly inside you. As this moment continues to unfold, you may find that your focus stays on your own life. Your routines. Your interests. Your sense of direction. You're no longer emotionally paused while waiting for something to happen elsewhere. Life feels active again. That's not because something external changed. It's because you reclaimed your center. Your soulmate needing to speak with you is no longer the axis around which your emotions turn. It's simply an event that may or may not occur. And either outcome fits inside your life without destabilizing it. That's real freedom. Freedom isn't cutting ties aggressively. It isn't indifference. It's not pretending something didn't matter. Freedom is when something mattered deeply, and you still learned how to stand independently afterward. You did that. This part of the story isn't about preparing for words. It's about recognizing that your inner world no longer needs to be reorganized around someone else's realization. You're already organized around truth. And truth doesn't rush. It doesn't beg. It doesn't manipulate. It arrives when it arrives, and you're strong enough now to receive it without losing yourself. That's what makes this moment different from every other one that came before. Not the possibility of conversation, but the certainty of who you are, whether it happens or not. There's a quiet firmness that settles in after confidence becomes natural, when even reflection feels optional rather than necessary. This part begins there, in that steady internal posture where you're no longer checking in with yourself to see how you feel. You already know. And knowing has stopped demanding attention. You've reached a place where the idea of someone needing to speak with you no longer rearranges your inner world. It doesn't make you pause your life. It doesn't shift your focus inward or outward. It simply exists as information, not influence. That's not because it lacks importance, but because your sense of self is no longer negotiable. Earlier in your journey, moments like this would have felt charged. You would have scanned yourself for reactions. You would have wondered why now, why this timing, what it meant about the future. You would have prepared emotionally without realizing you were doing it. That preparation was your way of staying safe. You don't need that protection anymore. Now, you're aware that whatever is said, or left unsaid, doesn't determine your footing. Your footing is already solid. You've built it slowly, piece by piece, through honesty with yourself rather than reassurance from someone else. That solidity changes how everything lands. Your soulmate is still approaching this moment from a different emotional landscape. For them, the need to speak hasn't softened with time. It has intensified. Not into panic, but into pressure. Pressure created by self-awareness arriving late and demanding acknowledgement. They're realizing that silence wasn't passive. It was active avoidance. And avoidance, once recognized, loses its power to protect. What once felt like safety now feels like a missed responsibility. That realization doesn't feel heroic. It feels sobering. You can sense this without trying. Not because you're emotionally tuned into them, but because you understand the pattern. You've lived the other side of it. You know what it looks like when awareness catches up after the fact. You know the weight that comes with finally naming what was avoided. And you also know that naming doesn't always lead to repair. That understanding is why you're calm. You're not invested in what this conversation might fix. You're aware that some things don't need fixing. They need acknowledging. And acknowledgement doesn't require continuation. It requires honesty. You're open to honesty. You're not dependent on it. That balance is rare, and it protects you. You may notice now that you don't feel the urge to rehearse your responses. You're not planning what you'll say if the conversation happens. You're not preparing explanations or boundaries in advance. That's because your boundaries aren't situational anymore. They're integrated. You don't need to announce them. You live them. Your soulmate senses this difference. They may feel unsure how to approach you because the emotional cues they once relied on aren't present anymore. You're not leaning forward. You're not pulling away. You're simply standing where you are. That neutrality can feel confronting to someone who expected either openness or resistance. Neutrality leaves no emotional handles to grab onto. And that's intentional, even if you didn't plan it. This part of the story isn't about tension. It's about clarity without effort. You're no longer managing the emotional field between you. You're letting it exist as it is. And what exists without management reveals itself very clearly. If they speak, you'll notice whether their words are rooted in responsibility or relief. Responsibility acknowledges impact without expectation. Relief seeks to unburden without fully owning. You can tell the difference now without analysis. You don't have to challenge them. You don't have to correct them. You don't have to reassure them. You can simply receive the information and decide what aligns with your life. That ability didn't come from detachment. It came from repetition. From seeing the same patterns play out until they no longer confused you. From realizing that clarity delayed doesn't require urgency on your part. You've already waited long enough. If they hesitate again, that hesitation doesn't register as loss. It registers as confirmation. Not confirmation of lack of feeling, but of limited capacity to step into accountability. And you don't feel compelled to push someone past their capacity anymore. You respect it by not staying. That respect extends to yourself first. This is one of the most important shifts you've made. You no longer try to extract meaning from what isn't offered freely. You don't dig for explanations. You don't chase understanding. You allow people to show you exactly where they are, and you respond accordingly. That response is calm, not reactive. You've also noticed that your emotional memory has changed. You can think about the past without reliving it. The charge is gone. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines you. The lessons integrated. The pain passed through. What remains is understanding without attachment. That's healing at its deepest level. Your soulmate's need to speak now exists in a different context. It's no longer meeting a waiting heart. It's meeting a whole person. Someone who doesn't need resolution to move forward. Someone who doesn't confuse acknowledgement with obligation. They may sense that whatever they say now won't reset the dynamic. It won't reopen old doors. It won't recreate access that existed before growth took place. And that realization can be humbling. Humility is where real accountability begins. You're not here to demand that accountability. You're here to recognize it if it appears. That recognition is quiet. It doesn't come with emotion or expectation. It comes with discernment. Discernment allows you to see whether what's being offered fits into your life as it exists now, not as it once did. Your life has shape now. It has rhythm. It has priorities. It has standards that don't need justification. You don't feel the need to bend those standards to accommodate someone else's delayed clarity. That's not rigidity. That's self-respect matured. This part of the story feels different because you're no longer narrating it internally. You're not telling yourself a story about what this moment means. You're letting it be what it is. That simplicity creates peace. Peace doesn't need answers. It needs alignment. You're aligned now. If words come, you'll hear them clearly. If they don't, you'll understand why. Either way, you won't be pulled out of yourself. That's the marker of true growth. This isn't about closure. It's not about resolution. It's not about reunion or finality. It's about presence. Your presence in your own life is no longer interrupted by someone else's process. You're no longer waiting for emotional permission to move forward. You're moving forward because it's natural. This moment doesn't demand action from you. It doesn't require a decision. It doesn't force an ending or a beginning. It simply exists as part of your story without controlling it. And that's exactly how you know you're no longer living from uncertainty. You're living from clarity that doesn't need reinforcement. Whatever happens next will meet you here. Steady. Aware. Unmoved by hesitation. Open to truth. Closed to confusion. You didn't arrive here by accident. You arrived here by choosing yourself again and again until it became automatic. And now, nothing that needs to be said has the power to take that away. There comes a point where nothing more needs to be processed, explained, or revisited. Not because everything went perfectly, but because you finally stopped carrying what was never yours to hold. This is that point. The kind of ending that doesn't arrive with emotion, but with certainty. You're no longer waiting for someone to speak in order to feel complete. Whatever needed to be understood has already settled inside you. Whatever needed to be released has already loosened its grip. And whatever truth still belongs to someone else no longer lives in your body. That's how you know this chapter is done. If your soulmate speaks now, it won't undo what changed inside you. If they remain silent, it won't create a new wound. You've crossed the threshold where other people's timing no longer determines your sense of direction. You're no longer standing at the edge of possibility. You're standing firmly in reality. For a long time, you believed clarity would come from conversation. That if the right words were finally said, everything would make sense. But clarity didn't arrive that way. It arrived quietly, through repetition. Through noticing what stayed missing. Through recognizing patterns instead of explanations. Through choosing self-respect when waiting started to feel like self-betrayal. That's the kind of clarity that lasts. You don't feel hardened. You feel settled. There's a difference. Hardened people shut down. Settled people open selectively. You haven't closed your heart. You've simply stopped leaving it unattended in places where responsibility never showed up. That decision changed everything. Now, when you think about what could be said or what never was, it doesn't pull you backward. It doesn't stir longing or regret. It feels neutral. Informative. Like a chapter you understand fully, even if it didn't end the way you once hoped. Understanding replaced hope. And understanding is stronger. You no longer confuse honesty with timing. You no longer confuse emotion with availability. You no longer confuse silence with complexity. You see things as they are, not as they might become if you wait long enough. That vision is clear now. If someone reaches out from awareness, you'll recognize it. If they reach out from discomfort, you'll recognize that too. And you won't feel obligated to receive anything that doesn't align with the life you've built for yourself. That's not coldness. That's discernment. You've learned that not every truth requires a response. Not every realization needs a second chance. Not every connection is meant to continue just because it mattered once. Some connections are meant to teach you where you end and where you begin again. This one did exactly that. You are no longer defined by what wasn't said. You are no longer shaped by what was delayed. You are no longer anchored to unfinished conversations. You finished what mattered on your own. The future doesn't feel uncertain now. It feels open. Not because anything could happen, but because you trust yourself to walk away from what doesn't feel right and stay present with what does. That trust is quiet, but it's unshakable. You don't need reassurance. You don't need explanation. You don't need closure. You have self-trust. And self-trust changes how every story ends. This ending isn't dramatic because drama requires imbalance. There is no imbalance here anymore. There is clarity. There is calm. There is a grounded sense that whatever comes next will meet you as you are now, not as you once were when you were willing to wait through uncertainty. You didn't lose something here. You gained yourself. And that gain doesn't fade with time. It strengthens with every boundary you honor, every moment you choose peace over potential, every time you listen to yourself instead of silencing your own knowing. This chapter closes not because someone spoke, but because you stopped needing them to. That's the kind of ending that doesn't reopen. It holds.